I'm longing to linger till dawn, dear. Just saying this. Sweet dreams till sunbeams find you. Sweet dreams that leave all worries behind you. But in your dreams, whatever they be, dream a little dream of me. Say nighty-night and kiss me. Just hold me tight and tell me you miss me. While I'm alone and blue as can be, dream a little dream of me. Stars fading, but I linger on, dear, just craving your kiss. I'm longing to linger till dawn, dear, just saying this. Sweet dreams till sunbeams find you. Sweet dreams that leave all worries far behind you. But in your dreams, whatever they be, dream a little dream of me. But in your dreams, whatever they be, dream a little dream of me.
Radio Swiss Jazz.
Hello. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Crypto Mondays, and it is Monday, and we have lots of pizza in the back, we have lots of wine in the back, and we have lots of water in the back. So I would invite you to go grab some pizza, get a glass of wine, because we're going to get going probably in about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to do probably about a 45-minute panel, another 15 minutes of questions. So go meet other people, introduce yourself, get out of your comfort zone, say hi, grab some pizza, grab some liquid courage, some wine, and we'll get going in a little bit. Thank you. Okay, everyone, please take your seats, grab another slice of pizza or a glass of wine or a bottle of water, and we're going to get going here in just a couple minutes to kick things off. So please take your seats and we'll get going. We're going to introduce you to our panelists in just a few moments. Thank you. Okay, you social butterflies, let's grab a seat so we can get going, and we'll have plenty of time to hang out and meet and schmooze and all that stuff afterwards. And we got tons of pizza, tons of wine, so no one's going to go hungry or thirsty. So let's get going. But before I introduce our co-organizer, who's going to introduce the panel, I want to introduce our gracious hosts from DocuSign, and they're going to tell us a little bit about this amazing location, if you haven't noticed, Bay Bridge out there, and pretty much as good as it gets. And then I think they have even a pretty cool offer for us. So, Boris, thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Good? DocuSign loves supporting the startup community, so we're really excited to have an all-female panel tonight. And we actually, yes? And we actually, not long ago, launched a blockchain feature where you can now take our evidence of a signature and put it in a neutral environment on the Ethereum blockchain. So we're very interested in this space, of course. Quick show of hands, who here is a DocuSign customer or has used this before? Thank you for your business. For those of you who have not or who are interested in 1-year complimentary DocuSign subscription, come and see me afterwards. It's a $480 value, and it's for new customers only. But if you're interested, come see me afterwards. Also, last but not least, we love social media. So if you want to take pictures tonight or tweet and post that you're having a good time here, please feel free to do so. And don't forget to hashtag DocuSign or @DocuSign. Great. So have a good time tonight. Just DocuSign. That's it. Thank you. Have fun.
Thank you. A round of applause for DocuSign and Boris. Thank you. That's awesome. And I would also like to acknowledge our other sponsor. Back there, you'll see a bunch of cameras. We're live streaming tonight through our partner, befast.tv, BEFAST.tv. They do a great job, and in fact, they have, if you go to their site, befast.tv/Crypto Mondays, you'll see the archive of all the former things we've done. So as soon as this is done, it'll be archived so all of you can see how you all look on stage. So that's great, and you can go back and check it out. So one more thing, I just want to let you know, for those of you, who here is first time at Crypto Mondays? tonight. Oh, wow. Great. Awesome. Thanks so much. So our mission here is to educate and inspire and enable people to learn more about blockchain, meet each other, and build a community. If you take a couple of letters on either side away from community, what do you have? Unity. So we believe in unity, and building community means building unity and getting people involved. We're not a technically focused meetup. Most blockchain meetups are very technically focused, but we do cover a bunch of technical topics, but it's designed to be, low impact. Anyone who doesn't know anything can come here and feel welcome at home. And so that's kind of what we're focused on. And I want to acknowledge my co-organizers, Andy, who you met out front, Yulia, who works at Google, and she's not here right now, and Bill, who you are going to meet now, and Bill's going to be our moderator, and he put all this together. So we're a volunteer group, and so if there's anyone out there who's interested and wants to help out, and in any way, we're always looking for people to help out and volunteers. And moving into next year, we're going to try and actually get some sponsors. So people were like kind of bumming on a $2 chuck back there, but we don't have any sponsors right now. So maybe next year we can up our game a bit. So without further ado, Bill and the panel, take it away. Oh, one more thing. So a couple of people said, that's so great, you guys have an all-women panel. Interesting story. So we have 2 women co-organizers, and they adamantly said, when we started this out earlier this year, they're like, we don't want to have a women in blockchain panel. No way. Like, we're not going to be treated as second-class citizens. We only want the best people to be on the panel. And so in this particular panel around custody, we were like, who are the best people? And here they are. And yes, they all happen to be women. So that's the reason they're here is because who they are and what they do. And on top of that, they happen to be women. So I think that's great because everyone says, oh, it's hard to find people who are, big shots in blockchain who are women. Well, here's the refutation of that. It's not the case. There's a lot of super qualified people here. So thank you all. Thank you, Bill. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hi, Bill. I'm neither a woman nor a big shot, so I'm probably the right person to moderate.
You got a cool hat.
I do have a cool hat. Yeah. As we. Oh, right. I was going to say I'm so loud. So, we talked for a little while in the back, and in 1 second I'll let everybody introduce themselves. I am outgunned at this. I'm not in the blockchain industry. I'm just here for my charming wit and stunning good looks. And I'm going to do my best to do as little speaking as possible, and let these guys do as much speaking as possible, because just the conversations in the back, I try my best to learn through podcasts and YouTube and reading, and I could sit and listen to you guys for hours. I thought it was great. So hopefully we can recreate some of that out here. To kick it off, we'll just do introductions. Who you are, what you do, what your company does, why you love crypto, whatever you want, what your favorite ice cream is. Take it away.
So my name's Maureen. My name's Maureen Downey, and I'm with SharesPost, and specifically SharesPost Investments Management. SharesPost is a financial services platform for private growth securities. So we are a registered broker-dealer. We also have a licensed ATS, and we have 1 registered investment advisor. I'm currently building our 2nd registered investment advisor, which is going to focus exclusively on digital assets. And we also have a full-service research platform. And so our mission really is to provide liquidity and access to the private growth company space. We started about 10 years ago, making a market in Facebook shares, which didn't make us very popular initially. But at the time, and I think it's borne fruit, we could really see that the private growth company space was going to continue to grow. I think about $1 trillion now is in the hands of private companies. And back in 1999, an average private company would be private for 4 years, and they went public when they did it for about $490 million. Now, a private company is usually the age of 13 years, and it goes public usually at a valuation around like 1.2 billion. And given the amount of capital that's gone into this space in the last 8 to 9 years, I don't think that tide is going to turn anytime soon because, one, there's a lot of dry powder in VC funds, but also more importantly, you've had a lot of new investors come into the asset class because many investors have figured out institutionally that they can deploy more capital when companies are private than actually when they actually go public. On to digital assets, that's a passion, I think, of ours because this is just another iteration of ways in which private growth companies can raise capital. And so, again, we're trying to provide liquidity and access to these companies that are essentially going to the capital markets not through a non-traditional way.
Hi, my name is Monette Stevens, and I run corporate development for TokenSoft. My background is both as a technical person, BSMS in computer science and electrical engineering, and I was also an investment banker for about 10 years, co-founded and ran a broker-dealer. So it seems like this space just called to me, and about a year ago, the two founders, a little over a year ago, the two founders of TokenSoft were getting involved with doing ICOs, and at the time there really wasn't a platform that was doing issuances that were compliant and scalable and secure, which accepted crypto as well as fiat currencies for payments, so they built one. I've been with TokenSoft since about January of last year, and we've been working with startups, enterprises, asset managers, funds, and we're starting to work now with financial institutions as well who want to provide tokenized securities. So what we are is a white label end-to-end infrastructure platform that will take investors all the way through registration, jurisdictionally, so we can handle U.S. regulated issuances as well as international issuances. The companies can be set up in the U.S. and they could also be domiciled in other jurisdictions. We've taken investors in a lot of our sales from over 50 plus countries. In one of the issuances that we supported, we took in investors from about 170 countries, I think. And we've enforced compliance in, different jurisdictions globally as well. So depending on how the sale is being structured, whether, what types of investors are going after, we take investors through KYC, AML, OFAC checks. With U.S. regulated sales, we'll take them through investor verification, accreditation verification. And then we're also able to do payment processing in crypto as well as fiat. So.
My name is Julie Dixon. I am the CEO of Titan Regulation. Titan is a regulatory consulting firm that sources consultants to hedge fund organizations, broker-dealers, exchanges, ATS organizations, mutual funds, and many other financial services organizations that are regulated in the United States. Our work in the cryptocurrency space includes work with hedge fund managers that are involved in trading digital assets, as well as with exchanges and ATS organizations and broker-dealers are looking to get into the space.
Hi, I'm Lauren Abenschein. I'm at Coinbase with the Institutional Coverage Group. My background's in traditional finance. At Coinbase, we look at institutional coverage from the perspective both of our exchange, where we're facilitating liquidity, as well as our custody, which is a standalone cold storage offering.
Great. We talked about some pretty technical things in the back room, and by pretty technical, I got lost immediately. But I think for the sake of sort of keeping it simple throughout the talk tonight, let's just start with the obvious, what is custody? What's custody kind of in the traditional financial landscape? I don't know who wants to kick it off, but anyone can
Yeah, I can take that. So custody in the world of traditional financial institutions in the United States, there are two types of financial institutions for which custody is a big legal and regulatory issue. So the first type would be investment advisors. And investment advisors in the United States are people who advise on securities transactions for a fee. That would include a hedge fund manager, that would include a mutual fund manager, that would include a Charles Schwab type investment advisor who advises retail clients. Those are all investment advisors, and they have to comply with a big set of rules in the US called the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. That particular set of financial institutions is faced with a challenge as it relates to custody. There is a rather detailed rule related to custody and the types of things that you have to do if you have what the SEC considers custody of client funds or securities. So oftentimes, financial institutions like that have custody either because they physically hold something like a stock certificate, or because they have so much legal power and control over those assets that the SEC sort of says, well, you have what is in effect what we like to call constructive custody. So in other words, your legal powers over those assets are so strong that you could effectively write a check to yourself. That includes situations where you might be the general partner of a limited partnership or the manager of a limited liability company that you manage. Now, there's a whole different set of custody rules and problems that relates to a different set of financial institutions in the traditional financial services world. Those rules involve what are called broker-dealers. So in the traditional financial services world, and SharesPost is a great example of a broker-dealer. In the traditional financial services world, broker-dealers basically they take transaction-based fees. So if you go to place a transaction in your traditional retail brokerage account at E-Trade, you're working with a broker-dealer. They take a fee for that transaction. Broker-dealers have an entirely different set of custody obligations pursuant to the SEC rules. Quite different. They have a whole different rule they have to comply with, which involves segregating their assets from the assets of clients. And it involves safeguarding and maintaining exclusive possession and control of those assets. So two different parts of the rules and two different regulatory problems to solve based upon financial institutions, what type of financial institution you might be in the traditional world. And each of these sets of financial institutions is now facing unique and different challenges as it relates to custody and the custody of digital assets like cryptocurrencies and ICOs.
So I've got like 5 questions. Forget about this for now. But all right, so I guess let's just continue forward. What can we kind of get into what makes custody in the crypto world different than sort of how you just explained it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a really important distinction. The threat matrix for digital assets is entirely different than what you see in the traditional in traditional asset classes. So you think about it, digital assets are bearer instruments. So the level of protections and the way that you approach security has to be really different for digital asset custody than it is for traditional asset classes. So that's one key area where crypto custody is a really different animal than traditional asset custody. Another one is just network participation. So you think about things like staking or participation in different governance protocols. Crypto custodians are going to have an emerging responsibility towards facilitating that kind of participation in order to continue to enable the most important features of crypto assets. And then another element that's specific to digital asset custody is the proliferation of assets out there, right? We're still navigating a lot of the regulatory environment, a lot of what it means to bring in institutional investors. And so as we see that proliferation of assets in the digital asset space, crypto custodians have an important role to play.
I have a question. With regards to governance, am I understanding that you're saying, one token is one vote in whatever system, Billy Bob's protocol, but now my token is being held by a third party, and so how are we going to sort of navigate that world of how do I vote when technically you own you have my token.
I think the point is here that there's a real proliferation of different ways to participate that's enabled by these digital native assets. And so, some of that requires, hot wallet orchestration. Some of that requires, assets to be outside of cold storage. And so the question is, how do crypto custodians facilitate that?
So maybe we should talk a little bit about, does everybody here know what hot and cold storage is?
Does anybody not know what hot and cold storage is? Oh, great.
Okay, good, okay. So just to maybe take it back a few steps, so hot storage essentially means that you are storing your keys for the crypto assets on a system that's connected to the internet. And cold storage means basically you've taken it off, so it's not connected to the internet anymore. So you put it into a hard drive or a USB, or and then lock that in a safe. I mean, that's kind of a simple way of putting it. What happened, why we developed cold storage, or that came about, was because initially people were storing their crypto assets online in different browser systems. And unfortunately, they were subject to hack. And there were other issues, multiple ones that came about. And so to kind of prevent the hacking and prevent hopefully the loss, there has been kind of either a hybrid approach, or in some cases, basically companies or individuals just taking all their crypto assets essentially offline and putting them into cold storage. I don't know if anyone else wants to kind of elaborate.
So one of the things I think we may want to connect the dots on is how financial institutions have to find secure ways to hold these assets because of the rules. So, one of the reasons why the hot and cold storage is so important in the context of meeting the regulatory requirements is that, for example, a broker-dealer like you has to maintain exclusive possession and control of any assets that they custody for customers at all times. And so that has been the fundamental hard problem for the industry to solve, has been how do we maintain exclusive possession and control of these things that are essentially bearer assets. And bearer assets, to give you guys a little sense as to bad fraud that happened in the past, it used to be in the 1980s, people would talk about bearer bonds, and bearer bonds were oftentimes stolen because they were, if it's in your hands, no one has to worry about where it came from, right? And you can go to the bank and you can cash in your bearer bonds and you can get money just like you can with cryptocurrency. So that's one of the things that's really key to understand is the forced securing.
So just to be clear, a bearer instrument, right? I just learned this 10 minutes ago. It doesn't matter, whoever has it,
Owns it.
Right, if this is my thing and I turn around and you take it, now it's yours.
Yeah. And that's essentially what it is with crypto assets. I mean, you have these keys, and if somehow you lose it, or the dog eats it, or it gets water damage, I mean, it's gone, right? And so it's important to have these keys stored in a place where, one, they're not susceptible to threat, and two, they're not susceptible to being destroyed, because that essentially represents your value in your crypto assets. To the point that Julie was making about, so we are a broker-dealer on one end, but that we are also a registered investment advisor. So we kind of have both sides of the custody dilemma, so to speak. And the way that we're approaching this is to do a combination of kind of using technology, but also doing, in part, cold storage, so that we have kind of a checks and balance, because fundamentally, the SEC is kind of focused on, do you have a good control location to essentially be able to be seen as a good custodian? And this has implications as to how much regulatory capital we have to put against our trades also when we're doing this. So it has, obviously a regulatory compliance issue, but then there's also an operational issue, which is important if you're trying to be an operator in this market.
Okay, so we sort of walked through custody, and now we're sort of mingling in wallets. My story I told in the back room was maybe similar to some people in the room. At some point, I found out about Bitcoin. I said, this is cool. I downloaded a little app called Coinbase. That seemed to work. I started buying stuff, and then I found out you can only buy some stuff there, and I had to send it, which was a whole, I copy-paste the numbers, I don't know. I'm waiting for an hour, and suddenly my money arrives in another exchange, and now I'm buying shit coins like, whatever I can find, because they're all going to take over. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to buy a Lambo. This is the greatest thing ever. I'm a genius. And then over time, kind of as you start doing more reading and start understanding personal custody and the fact that, oh, I actually own these things. Well, I don't while I'm keeping them on the exchange, so to speak. But now I've sort of moved into, personally, I've moved into some hot wallets and some cold wallets. And that's well and good for me, right? I'm one guy. I have a whole bunch of coins that were worth $1, and now they're worth a micro penny or some number. I don't know. Meanwhile, though, there must be large institutions who are, some of you here, but also just, people are holding on to huge amounts of Bitcoin or huge amounts of Ethereum or huge amounts of whatever, and sort of muddling their way through. I don't think, and you guys might know, I don't think they're sitting with a USB drive in Bob's, desk. So let's sort of walk our way into pre-custody solutions that are coming out now to what were and what are, how do large institutions deal with this, let's say 6 months ago?
So I think there still is a considerable amount of self-custody that happens in the industry today by institutions. That changes increasingly as institutions go out to try to raise capital and recognize that they need to have a third party, holding those assets and keeping control of those private keys. The demands that we see from institutions in this area are things like insurance. Do you have the security to make sure that you have a deep cold storage solution? Are there checks and balances in terms of withdrawal timing and who is able to do that? Is auditability built into this entire process? Do you have the operations and compliance, elements in order to secure these assets? And I think one of the points here is that, institutions have learned to ask those questions, even if they're coming from a place where they, joined as technologists, may not have had traditional asset management experience, but, are really coming up to speed in these areas and recognizing that these are the sorts of things that they need in a custodial solution. I think the days of, really trying to sort of muddle through some of these early, what I think folks in this audience who maybe have been in, those of you that have been in crypto for longer, experienced, a lot of those user pain points have been moved away, both for institutions as well as for individuals with the advent of new solutions out there.
One of the things I think it's important to understand about what Lauren said is that there is a regulatory requirement for your investment advisors to keep their assets with a qualified custodian. And I think we kind of failed to close the gap on that maybe. So to close the gap on what a qualified custodian is, in the traditional financial services world, those were banks, those were broker-dealers, those were FCMs in the futures world, and there is a little nuance to it that was not too terribly used until cryptocurrency came along, which also included state-registered trust companies. So what this means to you is that institutions that were registered with the SEC as investment advisors, so this would be your big hedge fund manager, this would be someone who acted as an investment advisor to pension plan assets and other institutional assets, they had to find a place that was a qualified custodian to hold these crypto assets, or they were out of compliance with the SEC rules. So that kept a lot of institutions on the sidelines. So once the industry was able to see these trust companies and other qualified custodians able to hold assets, crypto assets, then it freed up some institutional capital. The other thing that we think will start to happen is that broker-dealers will become able to hold crypto assets as time goes on. We do think that the SEC, at Titan anyway, we believe that the SEC and FINRA will eventually sort of loosen that up too, so there will be other places for institutions to keep those assets.
Yeah, I mean, this has been pretty interesting from our perspective, because when we got into the game, a lot of primary issuers who at the time were startups or maybe companies that had been around but wanted to go out to market and raise capital, with some type of a token offering, were trying to figure out what they wanted to do with the crypto once they were holding it. And a year ago, a lot of the early-ish ICOs were getting hacked because they were putting wallet addresses out there and just having people transfer funds to their wallets, and they weren't taking people through KYC, AML, any kind of regulatory compliance process either. So with our platform, our focus was to put structure as well as compliance enforcement around the process. So the first thing that we started doing with our customers, and these were primary issuers, or these are primary issuers, was to put, to do a key ceremony, and we had designed our own multi-sig cold storage wallets for cryptocurrency, and then to be able to set that up with them, but it was custodied by the actual issuer. And as the sizes of, the issuances were getting large, people felt uncomfortable, just holding their wallets with, large amounts of crypto inside them. So, one of the things that's become really important in that process is to work with a custody provider that can securely manage those assets both during an issuance as well as post-issuance.
So you can see there's two big problems, right? There's the real security problem, like can we keep it secure? And the other piece is, can we meet the regulatory requirements that are applied to us? The issuers, interestingly, have none, basically, right? So the issuers don't have a regulatory restriction, it's financial institutions.
Yeah, we spend quite a bit of time thinking through this, and I'm sure Coinbase has as well. Just one, because we're very focused on being compliant. The fact that we have both FINRA and SEC registrations on the broker-dealer, plus we have the ATS. We actually do custody private securities already. So, we've been in conversations, with the regulators because of the fact that digital assets are different than your traditional shares, you have to think about some of the complexities, which we've talked about here, in terms of how do you really actually get them comfortable that you have good control over the assets. And then second, because we are a registered investment advisor and we will be advising clients, be they retail or institutional, and we will be interacting with our broker-dealer, which is an affiliate, how do we make sure that if we're an exchange, as well as a registered investment advisor, that we're being transparent and appropriate with our clients' assets? And so that's when you bring in yet another third party to kind of do an external audit. So because of the fact that this is an evolving, growing space, you ask the regulators, you ask a lot of the people in the industry, different lawyers, and you'll get, all kinds of variations of answers. I mean, it truly is evolving. And it's also what makes it kind of really fascinating to go to work, because you're like, wow, I just solved that. Now I need to solve this other thing. So, and I do think that, crypto digital assets are here to stay. It's a question of where we evolve to.
This is a random one. Do you think it's easier to be a crypto company getting into custody or a traditional company getting into crypto?
Depends on your mentality.
We're not either, but my thoughts are, what I've been seeing is that a lot of the traditional financial institutions are realizing that this is an asset class that they want to get involved with. I'm going to cough here. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I think it definitely depends on what you're trying to do. Coinbase has a mission to create an open financial system for the world. That's it's a big vision, and we look at.
Oh, is that all?
Right. It's it's the sort of different businesses involved that help us kind of achieve that vision. And so I think it really depends on what you see your role in the ecosystem being, how easy it is to kind of come from one direction or another.
SharesPost is, I'm sorry, Julie, go ahead.
I would just say also, and how strong is your technology capability also is the other point. So I think one of the things that we know is that some of the traditional financial services players, particularly the people that are involved with custody, if you think about how old some of these businesses really are that are involved in the custody world, you think about these are some of the biggest, oldest banks in America that are involved in custody, and they are not necessarily known for always being on the cutting edge of technology. Some of them are, some of them aren't. It just depends. Yeah. But I think the technology part of it is the piece that really determines whether or not it's easier to go one way or the other. I think crypto companies have a hard time with the legal piece because oftentimes crypto companies, when you think about it, cryptocurrency is a little bit like cash in lots of ways. So in the United States, the least regulated thing that you can get involved in is basically currency. So in other words, there's not much out there that regulates the trading of foreign currencies, right? The FX markets, we would all say, from those of us who spend a lot of time in traditional financial services, it's the Wild West. You can do what you want in currencies. Spot and forwards are regulated by the futures regulators, but it's not very highly regulated. So the crypto companies have trouble with regulation, and I think that the traditional players can have trouble with technology.
I think it's really interesting because, so SharesPost, the founder actually is a securities lawyer, which is kind of a good thing and sometimes maybe not such a good thing because, I think having a good knowledge of the securities landscape means that you're kind of aware of what needs to be done, but you're also kind of aware of where you push the envelope sometimes because I think we've always tried to approach it from being compliant, but because this area, there's a lot of gray areas and rules have not been defined, you're kind of pushing to get a rule defined. And I think that that's kind of the challenge because many times there hasn't been a rule enacted or something hasn't been characterized, and you're trying to build a business and create a strategy where there isn't a clear regulatory defined path out there. And similar to, I think, with Coinbase in the respect that we want to be able to provide access and liquidity to this market because truly, I think that the way we've envisioned this is it's just really another version of means to raise capital for a private growth company. And we do think that companies are going to stay private longer. Maybe you'll see evolution of certain existing exchanges into be more of like an ICO kind of exchange. I really like the fact that there are other exchanges there trying to get into this market because it means, frankly, liquidity. And for me, when you have liquidity, it means you have more players coming to the market, which means you get more bigger players coming to the market, which means the market scales and it grows, which is why I actually encourage and like competition because it also means that also helps the regulators or pushes them to kind of define the rules. It's very interesting when you think about it. What we're trying to do now is create products and create systems for essentially an asset class that was dreamed up so that we didn't have to be centralized or we didn't have to be regulated. And now we're trying to put this thing back into some kind of regulatory box. So in order for us to kind of scale it and make it more access and global. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition in that respect. But we also realize that if you don't make it kind of within us or provide some kind of regulatory framework around it, you're not going to get the big institutional investors to engage because 90% of the world's money basically resides within insurance companies and pension plans. And they don't get out of bed unless they can write a $10 to $30 million check. And they got fiduciary responsibilities, right? And so they're not going to risk grandma's pension, unless they feel like, one, there's good control, two, they're going to do it compliantly, and then, three, that there's a means to put this in their portfolio.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And dovetailing on that point, oftentimes custody gets brought up as sort of one of the big reasons why there aren't more institutions in the space. And I think actually to your point about liquidity, it has a lot more to do with, do institutions have the, can they get into the size that they need to, and how mature is the asset class, and where do they really view this as fitting into their portfolio? So I think there's a lot of factors involved in getting larger institutions into the space.
Just to clarify that, so arguably at this point, the entire crypto market is just too small for some of the really big guys to care?
Yeah, I think really to be able to allocate in a size that works for their portfolio, and I think we're going to see that change over time.
Do they not know about the Lambos?
Well, I think if you break it down into pieces and you say like the futures market right now there are some really interesting futures contracts out there, but there's very little liquidity. So in other words, if you want to get your trade done in the futures market, you're going to have a tough time. And the ICO market, so in other words, ICOs have all kinds of trading complexities, but one of them is exactly what you mentioned, liquidity. So one of your biggest risks as an institutional player is your risk to need to go to cash. And so one of the things, if you think about what does a pension plan look for when they go to invest in an institution, they want to know how fast can you turn my portfolio into cash if there's a crisis, right? So how quickly can you do it? And one of the things these portfolio managers are always looking at is what can be liquidated in 30 days, in 60 days, in 90 days, in 120 days. And I think that with a lot of these ICOs, you'd have to go to a pretty great extent to be able to say that I know I can liquidate it for sure and go to cash.
That's a big challenge. I mean, you have some liquidity in some of the bigger name digital assets like ETH, Bitcoin, but when you start looking at actual companies and the fact that a lot of them have done their issuance, so there's only 2,000 holders or less, and you can't actually get more, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. I mean, the market will grow, but I think sometimes liquidity poses as big, if not more of a challenge than custody.
I agree.
So custody, liquidity, what are the other big kind of obstacles that we need to knock down so I can get rich?
Well, I think the SEC is really trying to get its head around bankruptcy. I don't want to speak for the SEC in case there's somebody here, but I think like we have pretty specific, rules on like the company side here now. But like, what happens if a company that's done an ICO kind of goes bankrupt? You know what I mean? And how is that dealt with?
I think also from a portfolio management standpoint, one of the harder things is a hedge. So one of the things about cryptocurrency was that it really was a long-only trade until futures came on the market, unless you were smart enough to be able to deduce what other traditional financial instruments moved in correlation with crypto, right? So it was a long-only trade. Once we see more derivatives out there, once you see more derivatives out there, I think you'll see more institutional players that don't want to just be outright long, but I'm sure you have views on that too.
Yeah, well, I'd also say a key point here is, investor education, right? So a lot of teams out there need to figure out where this belongs in their portfolio. And I was in, an institutional investor, roundtable the other day where, the group was asked, who can, explain the difference between Bitcoin and ETH, and actually almost nobody was comfortable raising their hand. And so when you talk about that, where does this belong in my portfolio, there has to be more socialization, more research, more, knowledge gain around the nature of these assets.
One other last thing, I think also market data is another piece of this puzzle too. When you think about traditional players, you think about this really, like there's a lot of market data that gets people comfortable with valuation at very small increments. I'm curious if you have more thoughts on that.
No, there isn't really very much data. We actually just launched about a week and a half ago the Shares Post Token Index. It's a non-investable index. We also have one for private company shares too, which is probably 100 plus companies are in it. But when we were putting it together, and we have a white paper that's on there, and we kind of do our weightings based on market cap and trading volume, we could really only go back a little over a year because before that, there wasn't much data for our index, right? So it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge, and having that, obviously, that data gets, I think, especially institutional investors, a lot more comfortable because, they have to go to their investment committee, and usually when you go to your investment committee, you're presenting a track record that certainly is, at least 5 years, and in this case, we don't really have that.
Even like a hypothetical track record. So a lot of times we'll see futures market players go to market with a hypothetical track record based on, paper trades back to a certain point in time. Even that in this market is tough. And it's hard to be someone who's in charge of pension plan assets and say, I invested in a strategy that only has 1 year's worth of track record and it failed. Well, who doesn't look like a goods fiduciary at that point, right? It's tough.
I think that's why it was so big. I don't know if anybody saw it, but the Yale Endowment actually put 2 crypto funds, and so he's written the book. He's got the great track record. So I think that was a big positive for the industry. But obviously, when he's got 30% of his portfolio in alts as it is, but your average pension plan has about 8% of their assets in alts. So got a little ways to go before we get the pension guys, I think, more comfortable.
Yeah, but I mean, this is all true, but at the same time, when we're looking at companies that are doing security token offerings, I mean, the biggest questions we get is the liquidity and what markets and what exchanges they're going to be able to do post-issuance trading on, which is one of the reasons why we've put forth the ERC 1404 standard, which supports compliant trading in the secondary markets, because that is important. And I obviously believe that it's coming. I mean, one of the reasons why we designed our platform the way that we did is to be able to support an evolving regulatory environment. So, the way that we've structured things is as regulations change, where we see ourselves as an enforcement platform, we can enforce those regulations, and if they need to be enforced differently in one jurisdiction versus another, we're able to do that. And we did that specifically because this is an evolving area. And as secondary trading markets are, starting to, really start to evolve and develop, we want to be able to support the secondary trading as well post-issuance. So we've been really focused on that as well.
We are really hopeful that in the next, once this election cycle in the next few weeks is over, that there will be some movement by the SEC, that they will come out with something. I think it's very important to remember, like, one of the reasons we've not heard what we want to hear from the SEC, particularly on the broker-dealer side, providing some clarity and some ideas on what's next for broker-dealers, at least with respect to things like custody, is that it's difficult to underestimate how politically motivated the SEC, quite frankly, has an incentive to be. So if you break this down to, and we just have to be honest about what the composition of the commission looks like. There are political appointees, there are 2 Republicans, there are 2 Democrats, and there's an independent by law. So political appointees are going to be reluctant to do anything publicly that might hurt the political agenda of the people that appointed them. So we've got to be very careful about thinking. I think, it will be a little bit of time. This election cycle will have to kind of close, and then we'll see if the SEC is willing to make some statements.
This is awesome. Now might be a kind of a good segue. So Coinbase came out with your New York announcements. Fidelity's come out. Can you sort of walk us through what are you guys doing? Who's your target, and why do they love it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Coinbase, is designated as a New York limited purpose trust company under the New York State banking laws. So that puts us under the regulation of NYDFS, and the stringent requirements around capital requirements, compliance, and security under a rigorous regulator. So that was, one thing that was a recent announcement for us, and it enables us to have a standalone, dedicated entity for our cold storage offering. And I think, that's, as I mentioned previously, that's one of the key, points for our institutional offering, and what we've kind of, heard from institutions that they need, alongside, security, insurance, and other really key factors for institutions.
So, sorry, I'm just sort of walking through it. So, who is the customer of that trust? The type?
Yeah, absolutely. So that could be groups like hedge funds or VCs, or any sort of institution that needs cold storage of their crypto assets.
And then, do they want to work with you because that makes them they're now compliant, or because they might just mess up they might lose their money, you know what I mean? They might lose their keys and all that.
Both. So there's definitely a component of wanting a third party to keep control of that private key, right? So having a deep cold storage offering means that these institutions don't have to touch the private key directly. And so, from our key generation ceremony all through, the signing of a transaction, we're able to securely keep that private key material. So that's something that's just important to institutions, period, is to be able to work through that offering. But also, yeah, absolutely, having a qualified custodian is critical for institutions, as we've outlined.
What does so as more players like Coinbase and like Fidelity kind of get into the space with the tools, how does that sort of change how you guys are either approaching going to market or approaching, how does having more of these tools in the crypto space sort of affect your strategy?
I think it provides you with more options. So I think there's a lot of players right now that are moving fast to try to come to market with a number of products and or services. And you may not have one of the parts that you need. So if you're able to access it, externally, and be able to still implement your plan, I think it's a good thing. I think too, having more folks out there opening the market, again, defining or pushing the regulators to kind of define more of the rules, I think is helpful. A big thing we keep talking about is liquidity. So, I've talked a little bit about the products and services on the investment side that we do, but then we also have our platform, which is, the broker-dealer. And on the digital side, we've come up with, we call it GLASS, so Global Liquidity and Settlement System. Because we are a registered broker-dealer, we have developed a platform basically where, 2 exchanges could come to our platform and trade, and then settle their trade compliantly with the SEC, which, is not something that's easy, but we're able to do that because we do have our broker-dealer license. And the reason we're doing that is, one, to enable compliant settling with the SEC, but also to pull liquidity. Because I think the more liquidity that we can generate in the market, the more the market's going to gale. So when I hear about a Fidelity coming into the market or some of the other bigger players, I think, one, it validates that crypto's here. I think, 2, you get more clarity, and then hopefully you're driving increased liquidity in the market.
We're seeing, since we do issuance, we're seeing issuers that are, financial institutions coming into this market that not only need to be supported on the issuance side, but also have ongoing dividends and distributions that need to be supported as well. So, seeing how this market is evolving and how the different pieces are coming into play and things are developing and there's more options out there, I think it only supports building this market and, making it appear to be and making it a real asset class.
One of the things that I hope to see, maybe one of the really creative financial institutions that are on our panel today can eventually do this, is some type of a global settlement system. So one of the things I think that really holds the world back to some extent is that one of the things people forget who haven't worked in financial services is that you can be pretty sure that if you want to go trade Apple on the exchange, that you're going to get your shares in your account. You can be pretty darn sure because there is a backbone to that system called DTCC that matches buyers and sellers. And one of the things that gives institutional players a lot of confidence is DTCC and a very organized way in which a potential failed trade is handled. So, what is that if someone fails to deliver into your account, there's a very organized broker-dealer rule and regulation that ensures that that's going to get taken care of between DTCC and your BD. Right this minute, that is not the case. It's coming eventually, right? Everyone thinks it's coming.
Well, if you look at what's going on with a number of the different consortiums, in the banking industry, you'll see that those things are actually being developed. I mean, you've got backbones that are based on Hyperledger, Ripple, Corda, all that are doing settlements and trade finance and globally.
I think once that comes to market, that will be like a light switch, don't you think, to some extent? It will solve some of the things that institutions are worried about.
And the major financial institutions are playing in that space. I mean, they're starting to put that into place.
Right, and that's one of the things that I think they realize they need to go forward.
Yeah, I think so. Did you want to comment on that?
Hey, where do you guys feel like, and this is just a gut answer, but so it feels like recently there's been a lot of Coinbase custody, BitGo, Fidelity's jumping in, Goldman's been flirting with it, but really large players are, I think, and it's a little bit, again, it's YouTube and podcasts, so again, I'm an expert, but it just feels to me like, God, are we just around that hump?
Well, you'll see that. I mean, if you start to do a little bit more research and a little more digging, a lot of the international, or I want to say outside of the U.S., financial institutions, global financial institutions have been focused on building out infrastructure platforms and have been a little bit more aggressive, I'd say, than the U.S. financial institutions. But just looking at what's been coming out in the news recently, I think a lot of the U.S. financial institutions have a little bit of FOMO and are trying to jump on the bandwagon. What do you think?
I think the other thing too is I was trying to value a company the other day, so I was kind of looking at the world market in terms of international banks, global banks, and I think it's something like 1.6 trillion is the amount of money made in payments a year. So if you think that you can maybe cut that down to like half that cost, that's a huge market. And there's not that many banks. There's not that many banks that are like international. I mean, there are, but there are not. But you can see why it's such an attractive area for banks to focus on, because that's their business really. It's holding money, it's wiring money, it's moving money around. And so I think that's why they're all like, hey, I want to get on this bandwagon, because you've got the Squares, those kind of PayPal, those guys kind of chewing at their ankles. And then you've also got this whole cryptocurrency thing, and you've got so many more companies now using cryptocurrencies to kind of move stuff around. I think if they don't get on this bandwagon and at least figure out how to get in there, they're going to be hurting from a business model standpoint.
I also think as you see the proliferation of more folks getting into the space, both crypto forward and traditional, with crypto offerings, it starts to normalize it in a way that starts to just take it off the table in terms of conversations. Specific to custody, it means that funds don't have to go out and have most of their conversation with their potential LPs be about a custody solution. Instead, it's that's sort of something that's more taken for granted the way it is in traditional finance. So I think we start to see this just normalization as more and more of these institutions get in, which is a good thing.
And I think that if you really take a step back and think about this from a macro perspective, it really does threaten the traditional players in some regards if they don't get in. So I would say there are two constituencies that have to be really careful about watching cryptocurrencies. The first of which are the traditional stock exchanges, because in the end, if you really think about this, an ICO is just a way to access the public markets that's faster and cheaper and better in many ways. And the current SEC commissioner has made some very positive statements about his idea about who needs to access the public markets faster. So what does that mean for the New York Stock Exchange and for the NASDAQ and the traditional players? They list publicly traded companies that have to go through a very expensive process. It costs at least $1 million to go public just to write your S-1. It's a very expensive, very time-consuming process, and they depend on it, right? And they've figured that out a long time ago. The other set of players that has to be a little bit concerned about this are the banks, right? The banks have to really sit back and think, okay, if we don't need the banks are already in trouble because the banks already are seeing disintermediation through payment systems. And if the system of cryptocurrency allows people to go outside the traditional bank infrastructure, the exchanges and the banks need to reinvent themselves. So my sense is that there's way too much smart capital behind both constituencies for them to sit on the sidelines. I think you'll see them move, all of them, and you're already seeing it. Fidelity is a very traditional, old line player in financial services, not likely to jump on a fad, right? And they're getting in.
The thing that I find interesting is who's going to be the first bank to buy some of these cryptocurrency companies. And I think they're kind of sitting out there trying to figure out what the regulatory environment plays out to be, and also who's actually moving fastest and has the smartest technology out there. And it's not just the banks. I mean, think about all the big companies that are out there, here in this town, right, that do payments all around the world. Think about Airbnb. I mean, Uber. I mean, Lyft. I mean, these guys, they take Indian rupee, they take, all kinds of currencies. And interestingly enough, some of them haven't gone out and bought, cryptocurrency company A. They've actually just started to build that multi-currency payment platform inside. So, I do think the banks, you'll probably see some acquisitions. It's a question of when the regulatory landscape gets a little bit more clear, a little bit more visible, because to your point about the Goldman, I think to myself, if I'm there and I'm doing an acquisition, I'm thinking, what could be my potential liability if I don't have enough clarity on the regulatory? And I want to make sure that, because sometimes these companies who've done ICOs, they haven't always done the KYC and AML, which is why it's so very important to do that. And then you get what they call a toxic token, and then you got to clean it up, and that takes time and money. And so there's that process too, and so I think, when you want to actually, we've looked at various companies to come trade on our platform, and they've been like, we missed something in the AML, and we've got to clean that up first. So that's a process, and I don't think any company that's publicly listed with a great reputation wants to go and buy something, because this has been the case. People have made acquisitions, and then only to find out that they've got to clean something up afterwards. So I think that's one of the other things that's holding people back.
I mean, coming from having done M&A for a number of years, this is interesting for us, and it's one of the things that we do sometimes get involved with, is what Maureen just called the toxic token, but is cleaning up the AML and the KYC and getting that cleaned up for an issuance prior to distribution. It's really important. But it's also interesting because it is part of the evolution of what's happened in this industry, is that people are now really taking that seriously from day one. Whereas a year and a half ago, some of the early ICOs that I was, aware of or was somehow involved with, that wasn't as big of an issue as it is now. So, I mean, that wasn't even thought of early on. And so it is legitimizing these offerings. It's another type of public market. And, when people look at what it costs to go into a public market, the cost is actually much lower. I hear people complaining about the cost of doing an ICO, but when you think about doing an IPO, I mean, it's not really comparable.
Or even just visiting like 100 VCs on Sand Road, right, to raise money. Right. Yeah.
Don't you think the exchanges, I think that one of the things about the traditional public markets is the exchanges play a great role. They really do. The exchanges verify all the listing requirements, and they really do a lot of due diligence. You can't just go be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But I think this is what you're doing, and it's really, the exchanges are going to play a role in verifying those things and making sure that those tokens are clean.
In the next 5 years, do IPOs exist?
I think 5 years is a bit of a short time frame.
6.
I think we'll see dramatic changes in capital markets. There's no question about that.
I mean, they're the taxi companies of Uber world, right?
Yeah. I think it depends a lot on several different elections that we have going on, to be honest. I mean, so you have to remember that, we need the SEC to cooperate for that to happen. So I think that.
Well, do you think at all, just with such a, what I like to think about when I'm, a bottle of wine deep and thinking about blockchain is just the silliness of countries, right? This thing's running out there everywhere, and there's no stopping it. There's no turning it off. There's no whatever. Is there any risk to just these regulations either aren't coming or they're too complex and people are like, screw it, I'm going to go to China, I'm going to go to Korea?
Well, you've already seen some of the biggest exchanges go to Malta, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like where they've left,
Caymans.
the developed world, so to speak. I think it's going to be interesting too, because it will also depend on how the traditional financial institutions probably evolve, because they also the ones that have a lot of lobby dollars, and so I don't think we should underestimate that. So those who are successful and evolve and start to play will probably be more supportive. Those maybe who feel more threatened may not be as supportive, in their conversations with people on Capitol Hill. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think I read somewhere like the Congo or something is like,
Hotbed?
Yeah, it is. I mean, they've passed all these regulations so you can open up your exchange there. But I mean, like states like, I think Wyoming, is it South Dakota? I mean, politicians are also seeing, just kind of similar to cannabis, that, hey, this is a great way for us to bring revenue into our state. And I think I was reading it, don't quote me on this, but I think with South Dakota, you have to be there for I think a number of years or something in order to get your license. Anyway, so I think that there'll be multiple forces kind of influencing the political landscape. But, I think if there's money to be made, and also if people want to make sure that there's capital flowing into innovation, that you'll continue to see this asset class evolve. I mean, to me, I started to talk at the beginning of the conversation about talking about how much money has gone into the private growth asset class. And it's really just phenomenal. I'm actually a portfolio manager at Shares Post. I'm on the investment advisor side. And when I take a look at, it's kind of a 1-to-3 ratio in terms of what's gone in from like the size of traditional venture capitalists. But there's this huge other slug of money that's like never been there before, and it's really come from, corporates, your traditional public asset managers, as well as the soft banks and the other sovereign wealth funds. And those investors weren't there 10 years ago, and now they're there. And so if you take into account like the 3x times the size of VC funds now, all that capital's got to be put to work. I mean, it's kind of like what happened before the global financial crisis. You had all these buyout funds sitting on like multi-billion-dollar funds. Everything blew up. Do you think they gave the money back? No. And so, even if we have a downturn, I think in the economic cycle, you've got to make sure that the money gets put to work, because these LPs are like, hey, I gave you the capital, this was in my plan, put it to work, right? And GPs aren't going to want to give it back because they've built a firm that needs the fee structure, that these funds. So that's going to mean that, more unicorns are going to, essentially be minted. And then the pressure always is like, where's the valuation? But what's interesting, though, is you've seen a lot of money come into the larger end, but you still have this dramatic need for capital at the lower end, at the seed and angel. And that's where I think the ICOs will be very interesting, is in that section, because now a Series A investor writes a $3 to $10 million check. Before they were writing like a $1 to $2, maybe $3 million check. So everything is shifted. So it'll be interesting to see where ICOs kind of play in. Will they go at the early stage? Or will, frankly, they go to companies that have a proven business model but don't want to spend the money or the time, really, frankly, to go do an IPO process? Because, frankly, at the end of the day, there's two reasons I think you really do an IPO. It's a great marketing opportunity. It is. $100 million funding for companies, that's a private IPO. Like, you don't need to go to the public market.
There's some interesting things, too. I think at a certain point, the U.S. is going to start to look at what's happening around the world. We have the largest and safest capital markets in the world. When you think about fraud, and you think about the fraud that occurs outside the United States on the exchanges, and the fraud that occurs in public companies that are public outside the U.S., fraud is a terrible risk outside the United States. So at a certain point, the United States is going to want to protect the farm, I think. The U.S. does not want Silicon Valley to go away. They don't want the innovation engine and the capital markets to go outside the U.S. Eventually, I think the U.S. will play, and I think we've already seen the SEC tip their hats to the idea.
Wait, so you were saying when I sent my ETH to iDice, that was potentially, that might have been a fraud?
Maybe.
I was on
Small chance.
Yeah, I didn't research it. My buddy said it was a good idea. I'm waiting for a response. I think it might have been a scam. Yeah. When you're looking at investments, like what does crypto bring you that sort of the traditional market isn't or doesn't?
Well, right now it's not.
Sorry.
Yeah. Right now it's not correlated, right? So that's really interesting. It's not correlated, and there's a lot of volatility in it. So, I think maybe you guys want to take this question, but that volatility is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I agree, and it's to the extent that it represents an evolution or a set of possibilities outside of the traditional financial world. That's a really compelling hedge, right? So there's very interesting ways to play this, within a portfolio. Also, the potential for disintermediation, whether it's in a data-focused business. Some of these new protocols really are going to have an impact to the margins of traditional businesses. So there's an interesting play here in terms of just hedging, a broader portfolio.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this before the panel about where does this fit into a portfolio, and there is a whole industry in the U.S. right now involved in quant trading. And, some of the best quant trading out there involves trading that looks and feels like a market maker with a bid and offer on either side that really capitalizes on volatility and movements. And the people who conduct that sort of trading activity have been just waiting and waiting and waiting for a volatile market cycle. They've been waiting it out since 2008, trying to find that volatility. So this is a great vol trade, I would say. It's a fantastic vol trade, probably the best volatility trade the markets have seen in 20 years, I think. And so that's where it's very interesting as a hedge to currency strategies. So like the rates trading desk, every big investment bank has a rates trading desk. And so those rates traders are very focused on, the difference between government bonds and different asset classes, the difference between currencies and forwards. And so I think that it fits in both places.
I'm running out of questions. This is amazing. What time is it? Yeah, we can do some Q&A. You guys got any cues?
This on the live stream, so.
There's just oh god, so much volatility, and a lot of times no one has any idea what it's. You said it's not correlated, but something's going to be driving the volatility. Like, how can you even trade that? Like, we all saw what happened with Bitcoin last year. Like, that was just off the chart. So it's hard for me to get my head around how you put that in a portfolio, and then especially when you're dealing with some of these newer coins that have very little liquidity and low volumes. It just seems overwhelming to me to get my head around.
I guess, why is volatility good? This is almost what you're asking.
Right, like how can you even manage it? Because it just seems to be
Relative value, really. I think that I would let the portfolio manager take this because you can do this way better than a compliance consultant. But volatility, really, relative value strategies, now that there are futures out there, I think are really what's going to make or break you with the volatility trading. But I'll let you handle that.
No, when you're putting together a portfolio, I certainly wouldn't put, 25% of my portfolio in digital assets. We're talking like maybe 1 to 3%, depending on your risk appetite. I think the other thing is that, yeah, there are certain things that are drivers. They probably are correlated to some aspects of the markets, but you're looking at diversification, and it's very different as an asset class versus, bonds or traditional securities.
Sure. Okay.
So when I'm looking at a portfolio, it's like, what's my risk appetite, and how can I put this into my portfolio such that I'm looking to potentially increase my return, but also lower essentially my risk because I am getting diversification.
So this has been a great conversation about custody. I have a question, which is there such thing now, or will there be such a thing as a custody standard that everyone has to do the same things? Because if I have a coin on, like for example, one of my ICO clients last year, they were only live on Cryptopia. And at the time, Cryptopia was a really small exchange out of New Zealand. They were so overwhelmed that people couldn't even open accounts for them. So if I'm dealing with Cryptopia, how can I make sure that that's the same level of service I'll get at Coinbase or hit BTC? So is there any standard, or is that something that's going to be coming?
I think you're going to start to see that standard enforced in one way just by institutional investors, right? So there just has to be, there's a baseline that's expected for any allocation of capital to happen. And so I think that's just going to be natural market forces that enforce a certain set of standards around, being able to do independent audit attestations, having certain insurance coverages, having certain regulatory statuses. So there will be a set of standards that converge similar to traditional assets. But from a regulatory perspective, that might be an interesting point as well.
So I'm curious to hear what you think, because I know that these guys, we've all spent a lot of time, anyone in this space right now spend a lot of time thinking about what FINRA is going to do next, because FINRA has a big role to play with respect to broker-dealer custodians. They've got to decide what possession and control means, and I think that there's going to have to be some kind of movement on a statement from them on what that means. And they do a pretty good job. To give a regulator a compliment in the United States, I'm a big fan of FINRA. If any one of them, is popular in my world, it's FINRA. I think they do a great job of taking a stand when a stand needs to be taken. They were the first people to take a stand on quant trading, on algorithmic trading, and set a standard. They have a great notice to members out there. I would love to see them take a stand. I'm curious to hear if you think they will.
Well, I cannot speak for them. I do know that I have a very, very lengthy email back and forth from a lawyer that we've been working with, who has listed 7 very detailed things that we would need to meet in order to be deemed to be having good control so that we could custody. And I think the reason that email was able to be generated, because I think there's been more feedback from FINRA than there's been maybe from the SEC. The other thing I think too, and Lauren made a good point on this, is that are we going to have a global custody standard? I think we'll end up evolving toward there, because if you want these institutional investors to start using the exchange or these custody services, they themselves are listed companies. They have boards or they have trustees, right? And they don't want to get a deficiency letter from the SEC if they've done something inappropriate. Like I'm looking right now when I'm designing, my products, maybe or maybe not, I won't have liquidity on my own exchange to do my rebalancing or whatever my products. So I might have to go to a non-US, non-regulated exchange. How do I do that as a US registered investment advisor? Like I need a set of protocols, I need them to give me information. And so I think, and I'm not going to trade there unless I can get the information I need to properly document myself so that when I get an SEC review, I make sure I've covered my bases, right? So I think that is what's really going to drive, more market standards and convergence. Because if not, these institutions won't be able to trade on these exchanges or use these custodians.
I don't have much to say about that. I mean, I think the exchanges are coming, and one of the things that I thought of earlier when you were talking was we are starting to see people like Northern Trust and the large financial institutions at least making announcements that they're going to be offering custody.
We'll see. They move slow. Some of these institutions go slow.
Hi. Thank you for the great conversation today. So I was thinking about the custodian that you guys were talking about. Basically, what we're trying to do here is basically using an old model to manage a new asset class, which in crypto, a lot of focus was put on to, a machine can trade with machines, you can verify independently, you can decentralization, all that stuff. So I'm just wondering whether you can share some stories on, real world, custodian stories that only happens in crypto but doesn't apply to the old way of doing things. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good kind of way to circle back, because you're right. There are really some unique aspects to digital bearer assets. As we kind of have thought through. And look, that comes down to thinking through things like how do you resolve sort of a multiple threat matrix when different actors are coming at you that are specific to the digital asset space. So while I don't have specific stories around like sort of ghost stories around attacks or that sort of thing, because Coinbase has had a phenomenal track record here, it does require a really kind of different approach to thinking through security.
So you talk about Coinbase was only using cold storage for the custodian service, right? But what if you the money or sell the share? Right here. Is that what you're asking? What will happen then?
Key for your business, that actively trade crypto, and so that's a process of storing that crypto in our vaults securely.
Okay, coming to you.
The other thing I just want to make one comment out to everybody here. This most people don't really realize, but for someone who's worked kind of in the financial industry for as long as I have, when I initially came to SharesPost and I was thinking about what we could do in digital assets, I was like, well, I'll just do a fund, right? Or I'll do this or do that. And then I realized that there's all kinds of limitations on the funds because they have a limited number of people that you can actually bring into the fund. And then also too, there's a lot of institutional investors who are still quite reticent. And so I was like, I actually really need to think about how I do this for retail. And that's something that normally retail comes after institution. And in this respect, retail has led the whole digital asset kind of revolution. And that's so different. It's never happened before.
So I have two questions. First of all, thank you for speaking. This was very helpful. So my two questions are, what were the hedge funds and VCs and institutions doing before custody solutions were available? And the second question is double-clicking into the insurance portion, because from looking at this stage, a lot of insurance companies aren't really insuring crypto companies. So how are you guys working around that?
So one of the things to know is that on the hedge fund side, so the issue of custody and being required to keep your assets with a qualified custodian is an issue for SEC registered investment advisors. So one of the more interesting things, I think, is that if you weren't registered with the SEC, if you were small enough that you weren't registered with the SEC and you weren't in a state that had a similar regulation, then they were able to kind of decide what they wanted to do as long as they were disclosing that to their investors. So if they had made good disclosure, I mean, that's about where I think the world went. And very few hedge funds traded cryptocurrency, quite frankly. I mean, the number, I think, was incredibly small, and I think that custody should change it.
Yeah. No, and they were doing self-custody. And, you know, since the early hedge and VC funds in this space, you know, really understand this deeply, they have come up with, innovative self-custody structures. So, I think that has been the process for to date. And now we start to see these institutional, offerings coming into the space, and that does include insurance. To your point, Coinbase has been in these markets, really proving out the market for cold storage and demonstrating our security and compliance and a number of other points there. But it is kind of a key area for custody solutions in particular to be able to make sure that they're insured.
Are these people switching to Coinbase cold storage, like these existing hedge funds that already have their own self-custody solution, which I assume is not scalable, and that's why they're outsourcing? So is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's not just us; it's others in the space as well. But yeah, there is a drive towards standalone deep cold storage offerings.
And I know from personal experience that a lot of funds actually kept their funds on people's treasurers and ledgers and drawers. So I mean, I don't think there was a really great thing. Okay, we have time for one more question. Anyone have a question? Anyone? You? Okay, sure. Then we have time, if you all have time and you want to hang out and speak, we have the venue until 8, which is about 25 more minutes, so we can all hang out, speak with the speakers if you like, finish up the wine and pizza. So I'll take the last question here.
Thank you. So the question I have is when you think of a market has to be deep in both directions, long and short, which you had alluded to before. For a market to operate both efficiently and quickly, how is the custody equation going to fit in on the short side particular?
Yeah, so this is where we see, certainly in traditional markets, prime brokers playing a critical role in facilitating that price discovery through securities lending. And so that's a natural outgrowth from a custodial product. And I think, it's something where, there's certainly opportunities, because to your point, to date, that sort of crypto borrow and lend is very limited right now. But it is something where there are a lot of opportunities for price discovery as that gets facilitated. And the growth of custody is a key component of that.
So how about that, guys? Was that an awesome panel or what? Thank you. I'm going to let Bill wrap things up, but I just want to let you know, Boris out front gave me this free year of DocuSign, which actually is pretty awesome. So if you guys want it, he'll give you a card like this, and you're good for a year. Thank you, Bill.
Yep. Thank you, guys. This has been great for me. But thanks, everybody, for coming, and let's chug some wine and eat some pizza and hit the road.